right, everyone. We might get going. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, beautiful. All right. Thank you all for coming. I'm only going to do a really brief introduction today because I'm going to pass over to David. But I did want to firstly welcome everyone to our beautiful new home. Clark Hopkins Clark is actually up on level 9, but this is part of this Melbourne Connect overall precinct, and Innovation Week is a really exciting way for us to have conversations that we might not be able to have with, you know, all of you in the room and the three special guests I've got with me today as well. But of course, firstly, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to anyone that's either here today or listening online particularly. So David's going to do a bit of a background and introduction, so I'm not going to do anything in that respect, and I'm just a bit of a host for today. But I did want to make a special mention of David. When we were discussing this topic, we thought it really important to have the views and the perspectives of some of, you know, our older Australians represented in the conversation. And we reached out to COTA, who were, you know, kind enough to offer to moderate today's session. So David Wright-Howie is our moderator from COTA. He is a senior policy officer there and has over 20 years' experience in a range of policy, research and advocacy related roles in both peak bodies, government and the community sector. His current work really focuses on aged care reform, housing, elder abuse and human rights, which is a great way to challenge our thinking, challenge our ideas, and I'm going to pass over to David now to introduce everyone else. Thank you, David.
Thanks, James. I believe I'm wired for sound. Can you hear me? Well, first of all, I'll just thank you, everyone, and welcome. I'll introduce our panel first, and I'll start off with Pazit Lavenja, who's from the National Ageing Research Institute. She's the principal researcher there and an accredited exercise physiologist with expertise in active ageing and age-friendly outdoor sites designed for older people. She works with government bodies in strategic development, built environment planning and public health impact. Then we have Cale Stokes, Dr. Cale Stokes, Executive Director of Advocacy and Research at Dementia Australia. And her strategic and policy focus includes elevating the voice of people living with dementia, advocacy on key issues for people impacted by dementia, building community awareness through dementia-friendly communities, and supporting international and national research. She's a background in retirement living and aged care. Then Natasha Wilkinson is the CEO from Donwood Community Aged Care and brings 15 years' experience in the aged care sector. Her diverse professional background and clinical passion combine to ensure Natasha takes an innovative approach to caring. A hands-on, customer service-focused leader, she believes passionately in proactive, personalised care delivery and designing more home-like environments. And last of all, James Kelly, who leads the Clark Hopkins Clark Architects Senior Livings and Care Team, which master plans and designs future-focused intergenerational communities supporting inclusivity, agency and social connections. He writes for seniors and health media and is an engaging industry commentator and advocate on issues including best practice design and defying ageism. Could you make our panel welcome? Thank you. Now, I'm just going to start off with a few opening remarks, some contextual type of remarks before I hand over to the panel. Now, when I tell people that I work in aged care policy, the most common answer I receive is, when are you going to hurry up and get it better so when I get there? I don't know if anybody else has heard that. That seems to be a common refrain. And I wonder about this response, and I laugh along, but think it's a pretty limited response and maybe indicates a level of ageism that's in our community about how we respond to older people. And yes, the Australian population is ageing, but unlike some economists and commentators, There are as many opportunities in that as there are challenges. And my hope is that some of the conversation today will bring out some of those opportunities in terms of design, both policy design but also architectural design and other sorts of design questions. And the recent Aged Care Royal Commission did hear evidence of some terrible experiences by older people in care, and also recommended some quite significant reform to the system. It also highlighted the need for cultural change, not only change in the service system, but I think it spoke to also change in our Australian society in how we engage with our older people. It commented on how older people should be responded to with dignity and respect, have autonomy, choice and control in determining the direction of their own lives, and have quality of life extending beyond physical health to social and emotional fulfilment. Older people, like anyone, want to be in relationship with others, and those relationships need to be valued and want to have connection with community. And amongst many of the recommendations of the Royal Commission, it called for a new Aged Care Act, which was to be based on human rights and not the funding of services. It did introduce recommendations about design, but these were quite limited, and hopefully this conversation will explore some more design opportunities. It did open a conversation about physical space and design though. So I think there's an increasing awareness both in government and the sector that services should be planned and developed with older people, not for older people. And their lived experience really matters to achieve the best outcomes. So what does this mean for the physical design and the cultural environment of our care services and our public spaces? I'm hoping our panel will help unpack some of that. They've been each asked a question which they're going to respond to briefly about their experience in responding to ageism and how they innovatively responded to that. So we might just go along the row here. We'll start off with you, Patsy.
Can everyone hear me? If I speed up or too fast, please raise your hand, all right? So I know I need to slow down. So my example I would like to provide is a comment that we've had from an older person as part of the work that we do, and that was a little bit surprising. So as part of the role for we're doing, we work closely with local governments and we train champions, which are volunteers or senior champions that we upskill them to become trainers so they can induct other older people to use outdoor exercise equipment. Part of the training, we also provide knowledge and a bit more information about physical activity and what they need to do to exercise safely. So in one of our sessions, which was an indoor training session, and we were talking about exercise and the safety of exercise, and someone stood up and said, "This is unsafe, this is too risky, we are old people, we are frail, we break bones." As you can imagine, once that comment came, there was a silence in the room. Now, we are few staff there and about 20 older people, which gave a bit of a bitter and uncomfortable feeling for everyone. So this is just to show that often older people have themselves some ageist view around what they're capable of doing, what they should be doing, and how should they live their life. In terms of the message, I would like to say, so with our training, the communication we obey by is around empowerment and positive enforcement. So we never tell anyone you can't do it or you're in a risk of falling. We always say you can increase your fitness, you can increase your physical activity level, you can certainly maintain your strength. It doesn't mean that you're likely to experience loss of balance. So this is just to show that often it's not just other age group that have unconscious bias, that sometimes older people themselves have those view about themselves and others in terms of those ageist comment.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Everyone all right for hearing on this one? Good. I'm actually going to start by challenging all of you and asking a question. So how many of you in the audience have got contact with somebody living with dementia in your family or community? Okay, so we're talking just over half of you. And how many of you have thought about how somebody living with dementia moves around their own community as a community member outside of aged care, for example? How many people have thought about that? Okay, so a few of you, which is good. So we're off to a good start. So I'm taking it to a bit of a broader level, which is that people living with dementia out in our communities, regardless of whether they're residential or living in their own homes, have an extra level of discrimination that they have to tackle. Because often when we think about age-friendly design, we assume that that means that we also tick the box for dementia, and we don't. So there are some specific differences in the way that we think about policy design, in the way that we think about the physical design that can impact a person with dementia, and that is different to how we might think about age-friendly. So we can unpack that a little bit later, but I think the key challenge I'd like to kind of make clear is that for people with dementia, it is difficult enough to be part of their community as it is. There is a level of discrimination that filters through pretty much every aspect of their lives, from getting a diagnosis to telling their friends and family about the diagnosis and the way that the relationships change, to the way that they engage with their local communities, where, you know, regardless of whether those communities are residential or in the broader community. And that has implications in the way that we design our physical spaces, our community settings, our houses, our residential aged care, and everything in between. So that's kind of the bigger picture challenge that we have when it comes to people living with dementia, which is especially important given that there's nearly 500,000 people living with dementia in Australia. So in terms of tackling that, a lot of the work that Dementia Australia does is around changing those attitudes, creating awareness around dementia, and the fact that people can live well and still be meaningful contributors to their local communities. So I'm sure we'll get into more of that later.
Hello. So I'm going to challenge you as well and say that we have 75,000 people that live in an aged care home in Victoria. And of those 75,000 people, they didn't have a choice. Their physical or mental inability said that they had to actually move out of their own home and move into an aged care home. So they had to pretty much leave everything that they had and then start afresh at the age of 80, you know, some people even 70, even 65. So of those people who still have purpose, still have an ability to do so much for the community, are put into an aged care home and sometimes forgotten. But with vibrant communities and with looking at design, we can utilise and we can make sure that these people still have purpose and are still very much of the community and can offer their services, their knowledge, their experience, and not actually just sit in an aged care home waiting for someone to come and visit them or to go and play bingo. So I think the aged care industry is definitely changing and definitely seeing these opportunities. And I know for one, many aged care homes will have integration with preschools, will have integration with secondary schools, will actually bring residents out to other communities like universities and secondary schools to have talks and everything. That brings so much purpose. It brings so much experience out into our workforce, out into our younger generations, and that intergenerational opportunity. With that, with design, and what we're looking at from now going forward is how do we integrate with preschools? How do we integrate with the community and don't just become an aged care home sitting on a piece of land with a group of people that actually have time, have a purpose and have experience and want to still give to their community. And I think that's something that we can really impact on as a community, and we can really start to eliminate that ageism that is out there in our community, that they're just in an aged care home, they can't help us. Man, they can do so much, it's amazing. And I think even Patsy, it's about giving them that opportunity and giving them the courage again that they are still important and can still offer us so much.
Thank you. I'm going to expand a little bit upon your point there, because when we talk about that choice and that taking that choice away from someone and effectively forcing someone into a community that they're not connected with in some respects, that when I meet with people that we design for, we need to shift the thinking to make that a positive choice, to make it a positive experience of ageing and a positive choice in the accommodation that is going to suit your ageing story long term. And I think one thing that I just should say is it's great to have a group here of diverse people talking about issues around ageism in the local community and in the broader community, because it doesn't happen that often, number one. And there's not many opportunities to talk about these sort of things. So I look at it and I say, well, there's clearly issues with government policy around staying in your own home. The homes aren't fit for purpose. There's social isolation that can occur, particularly if you've lost a loved one and you're in your home on your own. What can we do about that? How can we reinforce things around day therapy? What can we do around programs to get people to connect within their local community? Are there opportunities for co-living where people are living together under one roof, where it's easier to provide services to them, but they're with a small community that is of like-minded type of people? Then you've got to look at the current retirement and aged care piece. Is providing a 25, 26 square metre room and putting all your life into that a positive choice? Is that something that people are wanting to choose? How do we shift away from that? How can we provide higher care within different accommodation styles within overall sites? I think these are really critical issues to starting to shift the discussion away from I don't want to go to aged care to this is my journey through life, and there's positive contributions that can be made at each of the steps along that journey. And I think we've got a fair way to go to get to that point.
Thank you, panel. A few days ago, I was recalling when I went to visit my great-grandmother in a nursing home. Probably the first time I ever went to a nursing home. I can't say it was a very positive experience. The nursing home tended to be quite dark. There were lots of medical equipment around. Curiously, there was a dog that the residents fed who seemed to be getting quite fat. I don't know how many people here have been to a residential aged care facility, visited a relative there. A few? Or I wonder when we talk about aged care, how does the community perceive it? I don't know if it always perceives it that positively, actually. So that got me thinking, well, for an older person, what would be a more ideal way or an ideal experience for them about how they're cared for? And we experience the world through our senses, don't we? And I thought this relates to design. What do people see? What do people hear? What do people feel? What do people smell? I'm just wondering if any one of the panel, I might start with you, James, seeing you've got the microphone.
Natasha,
In your experience, how have older people responded to that question, and how is that incorporated into your design work?
Yeah, I think the critical thing when I have a conversation about aged care, particularly in a higher care setting, it's all about community. It's about how do we foster a community connection both within the site, within the campus, within the different buildings and things that we might be creating. But it's also how do we integrate with the wider community, and Natasha can speak to some examples of this as well. But I think the critical thing for me is for so long aged care and in some respects retirement have been we're tucking you away into out of sight, out of mind. And when you go to Europe and when you look at really great examples of intergenerational living, intergenerational communities, it's all about providing accommodation for people to get the care they need locally within their local community, which allows them to connect to the community that they've always had a presence with, but also allows that community to inreach into those facilities. And I think probably in some respects in regional centres we do this better, but in very much in the urban environment we're still a bit sort of hide away, tuck away. But Natasha, you might have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I believe we do tuck away. But there's two kind of questions to that. There's actually the resident and what the resident wants, but it's also what's perceived the resident wants. So it's the family and how the family feel that they're where they're about to put their loved one. Do you know what I mean? And so for that, they want the bells and whistles, and they want it to all look fantastic, and you know, they've got a swimming pool because they used to swim, and they've got the lawn bowls, and they've got this and they've got that. But if you actually then go and talk to the resident, they want safety, they want security, they want to know that they are still going to be connected. They want to know that people will still come and visit them. Because on an average, in an aged care home, your life expectancy is about 2.5 years. That's on average. I've got people that are in my aged care that have been there for 16 years. So, you know, and then some people will come in really palliative. So there's a real difference there. So please don't go home if you've got someone in aged care going, oh, I haven't got much longer. But the reality is they are frail. You know, they've been told that they can't live in their own home anymore. They do need assistance, but they want to be still connected. So we've got to work out how we design that, how we touch on families and how we get them so that they're not going to an aged care home and going, this is horrible, it smells, there's equipment everywhere. We've got to become more realistic about the requirements that we need for aged care, but stay connected. And we do that by bringing in communities. So we do that by enabling ourselves to build areas where we can have preschools come in. So you might have all seen the programs on the TV and so forth. Well, we have that. And it's amazing, and it brings people up. I even had a resident the other day, we had the news come in, and she's like, oh no, I don't want to be on TV, I've never done that, couldn't do that, I'm not coming. Yet she always comes down to the preschool days. We talked to her about that, and she went, okay, I'm going to do it. And she came down, and she was actually on the news, and at 97, she said, I've never been so proud of myself. You know, so every single day we can make that difference. We can integrate people, but we need our community coming into the aged care, and we need our aged care to actually be feeling that they have still got a place in our community. And that's where ageism is, and that's where we can do it with design and lots of communities around us.
I think there's an additional step for people living with dementia, which is that often people don't necessarily understand that dementia is not a memory issue. So yes, it can affect people's memory, but it can also have impacts on their visuospatial awareness, their ability to judge distances, their ability to undertake activities of daily living. So there's a whole range of impacts that dementia can have on a person. But we tend to think that if they've got dementia, they're kind of at the end stage of their dementia trajectory. And it's less often that people with dementia are asked about what they want or what they think or what input they would like to have, because there's an assumption that they don't have the capacity to be able to engage. And that's absolutely not the case. I mean, we have a vibrant community of dementia advocates who are people living with dementia around the country who participate in all sorts of activities for our organisation as advocates for systemic change. But, you know, they have opinions and ideas and suggestions and inspiration that we can all draw from. So I think that's sort of a key cultural change that as a community we need to make, that there's not this sort of automatic assumption that people with dementia can't make a meaningful contribution to the societies in which they live. And we know that when someone is diagnosed with dementia, social isolation is one of the strongest impacts that they experience. It's the most often cited concern that people with dementia and their families and carers for that matter have, because people stop talking to them. They're not sure how to approach them. They're not sure whether they're going to behave differently or change or have personality or mood changes as a result of their diagnosis. And so they just get excluded. And that's something that we do need to think about when we're designing spaces, communities, policies, programs, is given that in residential care, more than 2/3 of people are living with a moderate to severe cognitive impairment. for those of us living in the community, about 70% of people living with dementia are out in the community. You know, that they're not really easily able to be sort of corralled off into a separate sphere because they're part of our communities.
And Kale, actually, to that point, I think it's unfortunately by not listening, what it results in is detuned spaces that are deadened to the point that they potentially offer nothing to anyone as a result of we're designing for dementia. To David, your initial question, some of that sensory experience, some of those other elements in design make a huge difference to someone living with dementia, but it does tend to be, no, we need to downplay all of that, and that's, I think, through not listening.
I just want to bring a slightly different view around design. So clearly when you get to an aged care, when you go to any other open space, the flow in the environment plays a big role in allowing you, enable you to move around and do things. Mobility is one of the key aspects when you become older that is a problem in enabling people to maintain their physical independence. So really often the decision around the design comes into safety versus the choices. So obviously someone can make a choice if they want to walk or they want to hang on to something based on their ability. And often we impose in the design things that are not enabling them to move around, to go outdoors, to be in the green, if there is a garden. So we really have to shift the discussion and the view around how we can enable the environment to make them move around, feel comfortable, feel connected. So the flow of the design is very important. The indoor-outdoor is very important. And how you can make it welcome. They don't need to feel undermined. They don't need to feel that they are incapable. You want to bring that concept that they can do it and give them the opportunity to make a choice.
So moving away from people sitting in a chair or a bed for 9 hours all day until they go to sleep. Obviously need spaces where people can be physically active and also mentally active, I presume, as well, engaged in activity. I'm just curious if in your organisational frameworks, do you have, and I think some of you have mentioned this a little bit already, committees, processes where older people are actually involved? Because change is going to require leadership, and older people are part of that leadership. Does anyone want to comment on that first?
I can start. We love champions, we love our ambassadors because they are such an important aspect of the work that we do, for instance. But we found that if we have trainers outdoors and working with older people, but to be honest, when we have champions helping with the trainers, they're more likely to make an influence and impact on older people than us because people can relate to them. So having that engagement, giving them meaningful activity, things that they can make an impact on others is very important. So I'm all about getting them not just involved in shaping what we do for research perspective, but also involved in decisions and being part of the community. So we advocate a lot about co-design and having them involved in all facets of whatever we do. They have so much wisdom and a lot of experience, which should be encouraged and can contribute a lot.
I think from an architecture point of view, I think it's actually really not done very well, if I'm completely honest. Part of that is accessibility, I think. There is this protectionism that occurs with a lot of client groups around their residents, what the residents are going to say, what the staff might say as well, and that starts to become challenging. I think one of the things that we try and do in all our projects as part of our co-design process is not only from an Indigenous point of view, but actually the end user point of view, have a conversation with them. And that might be simple things like taping out a bedroom and actually experiencing it with them. But it might be just having a conversation about a day in a life. What does their day look like, and how would they like to see that improved in some respects, or what might enhance it, or what would they really love to do if they could? And in some respects, they're giving little teasers. And that's often where it stops. And I think we need to get a lot better at continuing that journey. And actually, as people, move through a building project, they often take a long period of time, people change, but there's a real opportunity there to bring people along a journey of that design. And not only during those early design phases, but actually when residents move in, when people move in. Talk to them about why it's been designed in the way it has. Talk about the community interaction that you're looking to achieve. Actually make them champions of the design at the end of the day, not just, us sitting there as the design expert, the client potentially or the operator sitting there as the operator. Actually embedding them as part of the design process, I think, is something we need to all work towards. I'm not saying we're there yet, but hopefully we will be.
I'm probably going to take it a step further again, as I always do, but for me and for what I've found in our community, it's not actually just talking to my residents, because they don't want to just think about them. They actually want to see their family. They want to see the intergenerational part of their family. So for us, one of that aspects and what came of some discussions around that was we actually built this playground. But this playground didn't have swings, it didn't have slides, it had walk areas and it had trees and it had rock walls and it had sitting areas and everything. Because what we were finding and what our families were finding and what our residents were finding was the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren would come in and run around their place or play in their trains or do something and cause havoc. And some of the residents didn't like that. But some of the residents loved having all those young children around. But then the parents were trying to always keep their children in line, and so they couldn't concentrate on their loved one. Or then they had to leave within 5 or 10 minutes because they were running around. So what we wanted to do was create a space that everyone could be at. So the children were able to run free and really enjoy themselves. The grandparents will be able to watch them and see them flourishing, while the loved ones and their own children were able to sit there and talk to them. And so the time, instead of 5 minutes, it became an hour, 2 hours, and it was a space and a place which was intergenerational that the residents wanted, but also the families and the children wanted, because the children were happy to come to Donwood or happy to come to a place like that where they could run free and they weren't controlled. So for me, it's about connecting everybody type thing.
I mean, I think what all of my colleagues have very clearly expressed is the importance of co-design, and that's one of those phrases that gets tossed around all the time. But in terms of actually doing it, there's not that much of it going on. So I think that where we're looking at design, you've talked about the importance of testing ideas with a range of different participants of that space, and the fact that what we think as designers or as policy makers or as program managers is going to be something that's going to be meaningful doesn't necessarily land that way for the people that are using or engaging with the space. So having those conversations up front at the beginning of the design process, and that's certainly something that we've done work at Dementia Australia in, particularly in the research environment. So often we find that in the past, researchers would come up with ideas kind of in isolation of somebody with a lived experience of dementia, and then come to us at the point that it was ready to be rolled out and say, oh, we're doing this project, can you find us some participants for it? And that was just not a good way of exploring different research. It wasn't a good way of seeing how research could be transformed into practice. So being able to engage with people right from the beginning, testing ideas, testing our theories, testing our concepts before we start to do anything is a really important shift in the way that we approach this stuff.
Now, when I hear about innovation these days, often it relates to information technology, which links me to various stereotypes that people have about older people and information technology. I'm just wondering if someone from the panel would like to comment on that. I don't think it's always an IT solution which should come from innovation.
I've got a good example. So particularly, somebody who's older and living with a cognitive impairment, there is often an idea that, having different forms of technology is going to be challenging. But we have any number of individuals that engage with our organisation who use technology to enable their lives and to increase their autonomy and independence all the time. So the chair of our advisory committee. So we have a strategic advisory committee made up entirely of people living with dementia of different ages, because obviously dementia can affect people at younger ages as well, under the age of 65. So we have a cross-section of ages represented on the group. But the chair of that uses technology to live independently. She lives by herself. She doesn't have a large family network to provide her with support. And she has her house wired for every kind of technology that she can to maintain her independence. So she has reminders on when she needs to take medications, or that she needs to get up and go to the bathroom because she may, get distracted and forget. So she has all of these reminders. She has reminders about contacting people, and she has more meetings than I can possibly imagine, and she has her whole day structured with reminders about what she's doing and how she needs to prepare for it, and that helps her live independently at home. And it's the thing that she values more than anything else, is being able to stay at home and live independently for as long as she possibly can. So,
and a good real life example is, did anyone have trouble getting up in the lifts here? We were just talking about this before. Yeah. So we have designed in this building, or it's been designed with a lift automation system, effectively. But it's a lift automation system that a lot of people struggle with. So when you talk about technology, you talk about technology solutions, they can go the opposite way as well. And we have to be really careful about using them where they get real value, and actually testing them with some of the people that are going to be using them. Because here, you press a button, you get into a lift, if you can read the lift numbering, but then you might also find that it doesn't really tell you which floor you're going to be getting off at. You can't change the floor you're getting off at. People might get into the lift at different floors to go back down, and they might be starting to talk about going down to the ground floor. You'd actually have no idea where you're going to land. And then when you actually land on your lift floor, there's actually nothing other than a little light that tells you that you're on the floor that you're on. So you'd be surprised how many people struggle to get to level 9 in our building out of the diverse group of people that are our clients and our consultants. So let alone anyone with any sort of cognitive decline, or any children for that matter as well. There's real challenges with just some everyday things that we do, and technology needs to adapt, I think, to a more universal design approach that looks to achieve design solutions that are actually going to work for the youngest to the oldest.
I think sometimes design is over-design. When you design things when you have no problem to solve, but you design something innovative and then it's not useful, we need to avoid that. You want to design something that is actually going to solve problem, which is an example why you want to have whoever the end users are involved in the design, because they can tell you what the problem they need solving. The elevators, I don't see any problem with the normal elevators you can still go up.
I think they were trying to avoid people touching buttons, but you also have to touch a button downstairs, so it's not quite there.
And the other example is probably COVID. The last 2 years, it's such a great example how everything has to be in extreme circumstances. Excel suddenly. My father, who has never used WhatsApp before, he lives overseas, and now he still knows how to answer. He still doesn't realize that I can see his face and he can see me, so I still see his ear when we speak. But just to show you that circumstances do create opportunities for people to upskill. So let's not assume that all the people are not technology savvy. This is so untrue. You can certainly create something. You can certainly upskill people to be able to use whatever you want to use. You just need to do it smartly and in a friendly way that people can actually find it useful to use.
And I think in the care space, actually, it's getting more unobtrusive. The technology providers are starting to listen to some of the operators in the space and starting to look at ways that they can be more passive in their interventions. Gone are the days of mats on floors and trip hazards and infrared laser beams and that sort of thing. They still exist in facilities, but the new technologies do start to avoid all of that. And I think that's going to just make life easier for the likes of yourself, Natasha, as you move forward.
Definitely. Technology it has an amazing realm in the aged care industry, like just the connection that you can have, obviously through COVID with all of our lockdowns and everything, to actually have that connection was amazing, and that's some of our residents had never seen an iPad before, so to have that. But then what we can actually drill down to and have, as what James has been saying, some real technology that's not obtrusive but actually starts to enable people to be a lot more independent, and we can be more of a back person that can actually look after them from their care side of things. You know, Kale talks about our dementia residents and the people that living out in our areas and so forth. The technology that enables them to stay at home because they can't put step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4 together, but with technology to enable that and to give them those steps right in the forefront, keeps them in their home where they do want to be. And then, even if they do have to come into an aged care home, we can give them those steps and they still feel like they've got purpose and that they can do things and achieve things, which is really important every day.
Yeah, certainly at CODA we find that trust and confidence is a key theme with technology. Often older people are not so trustful giving their information to government, but they might be okay with a bank, but a government they're a bit distrustful of. So I think with any technology, there's an issue of trust and confidence there. I wanted to circle a little bit back to research and knowledge. And how do you think we can advance research and knowledge in this space?
Get more funding. That's a different.
Apart from that.
That's a different issue. I mean, with research, you do have to think about innovation and need, and often with research, it addresses a specific agenda on a national level. For example, the aged care is one of them. When trying, maybe find a new model of service that's going to work better with older people. So research is a tool to provide people with the evidence base, allow researchers and others to experiment something, find some solution, hopefully for the research to then, that knowledge to be used by whoever is going to in practice using them. Yeah. So, the diversity of what research can do is quite important and help us to advance knowledge and be the forefront, I guess.
Others?
Research translation. And one of those other phrases that gets used quite a lot, but we don't necessarily achieve on a regular basis. I think it comes back to the previous question that we've just discussed, which is the starting point of the problem that we want to solve. Because I think sometimes the way that we start to frame a problem isn't quite right, and it doesn't actually lend itself to then being applied in a practical way. So I think having that engagement with people who are actually going to be the users or recipients or designers even of that space is a very important first step. But I think we also need to be thinking about practical, so not innovating for the sake of innovation, innovating for the sake of improving the quality of life of people that are using our environments and our spaces. And I think that shifts the focus a little bit and means that we are actually looking at how those things can be applied. Because where there is a really successful example and we can shout about it and demonstrate the impact of it, demonstrate how it creates a better quality of life, then other people will want to get on that bandwagon, and that's when you see policy change. That's when you see, and it's slow, right? It's very slow. But that's where you get that momentum that says, well, actually, this should be the way it is for all of us. And then you start to see that change at the policy level. But it does take time, and it does require us to start with the right question that we want to answer.
And definitely I cannot speak to the research part of that question, but the knowledge part is really interesting. And I think that the key thing for me is we have to change the negative media perception of the care industry and of ageing. We have to have positive conversations around design, around ageing, around the process of ageing, and that stems from having conversations like this, sharing knowledge with people who are in the industry, who are involved in care, but also those who aren't. Because the more that we shape a more positive story, the more positive the environment becomes, the easier it should be to make more substantial change. We've, on a lot of policy fronts, we have gone down a path of the negative sentiment and the negative story is what's going to force change. I think we need to take a step back, and when you're talking about people, you need to talk about the positive experience that those people are going to achieve and going to receive through the work that you're doing. So that would be my thoughts on knowledge.
I'd have to agree with James on knowledge. If you think about your own home, you think about your own family, their culture, their morals, their values, how they perceive rules from our governments, and then you bring that into an aged care home. So every aged care home, there's 750 in Victoria, we all have different cultures. We all have the same rules, we all work under the same act, we all have the same policies, we all have the same regulations. But we see things differently, just like every one of your families do. And so that's why it's very difficult to even design something or to come up with a common theme, because we all have different care models as well of how our group want to be cared for or how our group like it. You know, you've got people that love community and want to be amongst community. You have people that are introverts, extroverts, and you're combining them all in one area. So you've got to get an overall design, an overall knowledge, an overall culture, and you bring that together. And then that's what kind of works. But it doesn't always work. So, and as governments don't always. But as James said too, you know, the media are out there for aged care. You've got to think about every 75,000 people that are in aged care, they've been told they can't go home. They've been told they can't go home, they have to go into an aged care home. So they've been told, you've got to go into an industry that's negative, horrible, going to treat you badly at their most frail and vulnerable time. Now, has the media done that? Have we done that as an industry? Who's done that? And how do we change that perception through design, through knowledge, through research and everything to ensure that the people, the most vulnerable people, those 75,000 people in Australia, in Victoria, actually feel comfortable to go into a place that they have no choice about?
Now, we've had a pandemic, haven't we? We've had a COVID pandemic, and I just wondered if that's taught us anything about innovation and design.
Yeah, the simple truth is yes, massively. Housing a lot of people under one roof is problematic in a pandemic environment, particularly people who don't necessarily want to listen to you and don't want to follow the rules that you're setting out. And when you have staff that perhaps don't want to follow those rules as well. And you've got circumstances whereby you cannot design out everything. We need to be really careful about this, because if we go down the path of pandemic proof, we are going into a hospital isolation ward environment. And I think that we have to be very, very cognizant of the risks that people are taking in every element of their lives. People broke the rules during COVID because they wanted to meet up with someone. They took that risk and that was their choice. In an aged care environment, we need to design a safe environment that can safely house residents, but it needs to be unobtrusive in doing so, because otherwise I think we throw the baby out with the bathwater, basically. I think we solve one problem to create a bigger problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think for people living with dementia, particularly those in residential care, COVID's been tough because you can have well-designed spaces that have flexibility, but when it came to, you know, crunch time, particularly here in Victoria, people were isolated in their rooms. They were isolated from care partners and family members who may have been an integral part of their day-to-day care, and they weren't coming in to see them. So there were, you know, declines in cognitive health, in general health. There was an increased sense of social isolation. And for people with a cognitive impairment, once those changes occurred, they didn't bounce back from them. So it wasn't just a kind of, you know, finite thing. Once their cognition had changed, it fundamentally changed. So, you know, that really demonstrated that being able to engage in a physical space is important, but the social connections, the relationships, that is absolutely vital, and that can be reflected and understood in physical design, but it's also a very important part of our culture and the way that we engage with one another as individuals.
I think if I try and put a public health perspective, not necessarily within the aged care setting per se, what we've learned is that we all need to have outdoor space, or space that we can go out and move. We all need to be connected in a way that we can, if that was going to the local park, understanding the concept around inequities when you've got suburbs that don't have that access to their community or that area. So from the public health perspective and from policymaker perspective, this is where we could also, and I could see from my research work, the shift within a local government's view of, okay, now we need to figure out how we can design a space that it's not just for children, that there are other age groups that we need to be more inclusive in how we can do it with the community. So yes, we've done a lot of mistakes during the last 2-3 years. We are learning from it. And it's one of the things that you want to capitalize on it while, you know, the momentum is there. You want to grab it and make as many changes as you can to then cement those changes within the community so others can follow and, you know, to make a better outer space. And with the aged care setting, I think a lot of older people have been stripped from the right to make a choice. Who are we to decide if they need to be locked in the room? Where when you look at others that live in the community, they make a choice if they want to go outside or they want to go for a walk. So there's a bigger moral question, I think, when it comes to that aged care setting. Have we done the right things? And maybe we do need to think about how we can design it in a way that people can move, and we're not going to impose them, you know, in a confined area, taking away, you know, human rights of being able to choose where to walk and to move.
I'd like to put another swing on it. If you actually think about the aged care setting, so you think about that in Victoria, we have 750 aged care facilities. Out of that, there was about 239 in the first year that had an outbreak. Out of that, there was probably only about 24 that had really serious outbreaks. So if you think about that, 75,000 people in an aged care setting, how bloody well did we do in COVID? Really. Like in a community living, having people still amongst you all the time. We had staff doing personal care like right up close, you know, and so that from a positive side of it, that community did really, really well during COVID, even though we had a lot of deaths and we had some really horrific things that happened in our industry. I will not deny that. But it was really minuscule as well. And so we're not all perfect. You know, out of that 750, we're not all perfect, but we will learn. And I think from our perspective, we definitely learned that isolation, that deterioration, not staying connected, was no good for the aged care industry, but it was no good for any one of us. Any one of us. So, you know, going forward, we'll be able to learn about that design, learn how important it is to have the open space, and like look at this space that's been created and the vibrancy that is here. Every time I walk here and come and see James, I see the vibrance and the intergenerational side of things, and I think we can really learn from that as well.
Okay, well, we've barely scratched the surface, I think. I feel like we could go on for hours, but we've come to the end of time, so would you thank our panel? And I believe I'm inviting questions from the audience. Would anyone like to start? We'll go here and then we'll go up there. You start and then we'll go up there.
Okay. I'm involved in aged care from a board perspective, and I absolutely endorse everything that's been said today. One of the key things in the decision-making process around what to do for residents is the whole governance aspect. So, and a lot of this came through with the Royal Commission, that we are living in a litigious world. We're all very concerned about risk and how we manage that. But I think what we've got to encourage our policymakers to understand is that if we want our elderly to live their best life, they have to be able to take the risks that they want to take. And to enable them to take the risks that they want to take, the providers of aged care need to be able to allow them to do that without the risk of themselves then being held accountable when the inevitable will go wrong. And that's part of growing old. So one of the big enablers for change needs to be how we create an environment where it is okay for individual operators to take risks. The comment was made by Natasha that we all live under the same rules and regulations and policy settings. But I think what our elderly population would appreciate is the ability to be able to get variety in the sorts of services and the settings in which they want to live. So we're creating peas in a pod because we're all tied in the same way. So a few key policy issues have to change, and risk settings need to be recognised to enable this to happen. But I absolutely agree. All of what we've talked about so far is critical.
Well, I can assure you in policy circles we do talk about dignity of risk weighed up with protections, but you didn't have a specific question?
But that was and how do we
point.
influence that? How do we change those? How do we change that perception?
Does anyone from the panel want to, Kaya?
I mean, I think that where we're talking about the aged care quality standards, where we're talking about building design standards, where we're talking about all the different compliance systems that we have to operate within, particularly within aged care, it's about seeing them as a foundational level of quality. It is not about what we need to aim to achieve. It's about what we need to be just kind of getting to. And then anything that we do after that, I think, is a conversation, and the results speak for themselves. So I think where there is clarity around people having discussions about their level of risk and the risk that they want to take, where there is evidence that those conversations have actually occurred in the first place, then I don't think we have the kind of barriers that perhaps, you know, some of the more risk-averse of us actually think are there, because where somebody is living the life that they want, that they're achieving the quality of life that they want, that they're taking the risk that they want, and that is clearly in evidence in what the way that they're engaging within their space, whether that be at home or in residential care, then there's not really any reason why the compliance, the regulators would be pushing back on that, because, you know, we're demonstrating that there is a quality of life that's being supported.
I can just add that this is where research can be very, very beneficial. For policymakers, you want to have the dollar sign at the end of it. If you show them that if you do something in a certain way that is evidence-based and they're going to save them money, this is where you can start seeing the changes. So with respect to the design, for example, if you do some sort of activity and you found that there is no risk, there's benefits for the residents, benefits for community members, this is where you have the evidence to show this is working, it is safe enough, scale up or do changes. So this is where we can complement potentially with evidence-based, so whatever decision is being made is decision that has, again, cost saving and beneficial on the personal level for quality of life, you know, living better, living stronger, living longer.
I think we had another question. This lady with glasses, thank you. Up here.
Thank you so much. Hi. In a way, my question is going to be a good segue to the previous discussion around the policy settings influencing what we get and what we allow people to do. And I guess taking inspiration from the title of today, which is about designing to defy ageism, do you believe that we're putting the wrong lens on the whole design concept right from the start, because we talk about it as a care environment instead of actually an environment to enable people to live their best life? We've flipped the problem the wrong way around, and it's driven as a result from a sort of a regulatory perspective and what suits the workforce. We come across this as a challenge all the time, and we're actually not starting, I think, the comment was made earlier about defining the problem correctly and about what we want to get from this to support people the way they want to live, because they don't want you to provide this support so that they can just sit there and be isolated from the community. They want you to help them so they can live their life. So that's my question for you.
It's an interesting one. I always like, most often we get briefs that contain some form of, we need this many beds, we need this, we need that. And I think we need to shift the thinking around to what is the problem we're trying to solve. And for every community, that should actually be different. It's likely to be different. And that may actually result in a different bed scenario than maybe we were thinking, or a different configuration of choice and accommodation options. So I do think you're right that we often come at it as what are we caring for and how do we go about that care? And I think we probably do need to start to think about what is the problem that we're trying to solve here, which is more societal in many respects, or it might be a local community issue that becomes the key piece that we need to look to solve.
I think it's difficult to have that care model plus what we actually want from a home-based perspective, and then what we need from a cost-based operational perspective, and that money it just doesn't grow on trees. So there's a compromise with everything. Land as well, we're talking about open space, you're talking about, ultimately to be able to design the perfect place with everyone's own little home that they've moved, they've gone from their big home to a little home that they can be cared for in would obviously be, the best opportunity you can, or to keep them in their own home. But we know, even through home care and the packages and where we're going with government, that home care has its own problems with it. Then puts a lot of burden on the carers and the family unit around, because they're all like, no, we don't want to go into aged care because that's just not where we want to go. But the pressure that's on the family unit to actually then look after their loved one in their own home, which is not ideal for their health or clinical needs either, and then they're isolated. So it's a massive, massive problem. But we'll get there. We will get there. And as David said earlier, how are you going to fix aged care by the time I get into it? Well, every single one of us, and I reckon every single one of us here, would have a different way of how we want to be treated in an aged care home. And that's potentially a bit of the difficulty.
Other questions? I think we're just about ready to wrap up. So thanks again to the panel. We had one quick question.
Hello, my name's Sophia. I work as an urban designer, and the conversation has been really great. It's been really interesting, but I think my interest is in it's obviously important to understand aged care homes and retirement villages and so forth, but how do we also ensure that they're fully integrated into our streets, our public spaces, other amenity within the neighbourhoods and within the cities? And I guess often for me, I often think, okay, as a designer, design guidelines are a good place to start. But having kind of understood there's a lot of diversity and complexity in the different conditions that people have, there's neurodiversity as well as cognitive impairment, is there a sense that an approach to having design guidelines would actually not really address and provide, I guess, the environment that would actually bring people into our cities in a more integrated way?
Well, I think there's a whole other forum in that
I think
question.
we're all rummaging for the microphone to say something on this one. From my perspective, I think there's two things. One, thinking about how people living in residential care get out into the broader community, and how we bring the broader community into residential care. So I think it kind of goes both ways where we're thinking about that. But it does come down to all levels of government and communities as a whole thinking about all of the constituent parts of their community and how we're engaged and connected. So, I'll leave it at that, because I know that James is champing at the bit to say something too.
I was just going to say that, to finish on a bit of a sour note, but we haven't solved this in a number of different forms of life. Affordable housing, social housing, childcare, many aspects of our community. We have not solved the way to create diversity in our communities and our neighbourhoods. And I think aged care is another component of that, or care generally. The simple truth of it is, the more that we can embed care and solutions for people to age within the local community that they've resided in their whole life, the more successful it will be. And That is a land, the availability of land issue, it's the cost of land issue, it's the scale of operations issues that you come across that all create issues in that respect. So I don't think there's one silver bullet on that one. I think the more that people talk about it, the more that people try different things and different scales and different ways of working, maybe the better off we will be in getting it a lot more interconnected in the local community.
Thanks, everyone. Great for you all to be here, and that concludes our session.